Okay, so I'm honored and pleased to welcome you at this international conference that INAPP is organizing, the Socio Economic Impact of Technological Change, Theory, Empirics, and Policy. First of all, I bring you the greetings of our president and of our general director, which were expected to give the introductory speech. Unfortunately, they are now busy in the INAPP's board, but they will join us during the morning and for sure intervene and add to the words that I would tell you as an introduction. As I said, we are very, very pleased and honored to welcome the large set of top-level speakers that that joined us, that accepted our invitation, and of course of all participants and the large amount of people that already manifested their interest in the conference that we organized. This conference is very important also because is a way of focusing and of deepening our look in one of the strategic research areas of our institute, the analysis of the impact of technological change on work, on the dynamics of labor markets, on society in general, and so on the evolution of socio-political preferences and political behavior. All the things are part of a research trend that is strategic for the Institute and that builds on a long-lasting experience that this Institute has in terms of labor market analysis, economic, sociological analysis, and more in general, interdisciplinary analysis concerning the dynamics of labor markets and how key features of the economy as technological change can reshape, drive, and guide the evolution of the economy and of the labor market in particular. Of course, one of the reasons why now the object of the impact of technological change of labor markets is so much back to the fore is due to the increasing fears of mass unemployment, of disruption, of phenomena that we are not sure our institutions are up to deal with concerning the large amount of risks that in particular, the more fragile components of our society and of labor markets are facing. So, given our mission, INAPP will for first provide high-level scientific research and expertise in order to understand the phenomena at stake and to understand them both qualitatively and quantitatively, but the very aim of this research activity is at the very end providing sound policy advice and a set of evidence that can be worth for policymakers in order to take action and reducing the risks that I already mentioned and maximize opportunities that are of course entailed in the deep changes that are unfolding and that are affecting our labor markets. I will rapidly go through the structure of the conference and to a brief examination of what we expect in terms of panel and contents, and then I will of course leave the floor to the first distinguished set of speakers that will talk us about a very relevant publication that is out since the beginning of this year, if I'm not wrong, half of this year, which is the book Work in the Digital Age. The editors of the book are here, and we are very pleased of hosting them and having them as as drivers of the discussion around the themes of the book. The book is relevant because it's very comprehensive, includes prominent scholars, and which one of those is an important person to provide advices and analysis on complex things that are analyzed in the book, from the platform economy, on the impact of technological change on quality and quantity of work, and again, with an interdisciplinary take, most of the features that relate to the impact of technological change on work, on income, on employment are dealt with in the book. And so having the opportunity of discussing it is a big opportunity for us, because it will be for sure enriching. The session will be chaired by Director General Paolo Reboani, and we are very thankful for chairing this panel, and also to contribute to organizing this very important panel within our conference. In the afternoon, the second session of the conference will focus on the socio-economic impact of technological change, and we are very excited about this panel because, as you will see, this will deal with frontier research, because not that much in quantitative terms especially has been done concerning the impact that technological change and risks related to technological change might have on political behavior, social political preference, voting behavior. But we do think, even considering the recent global developments, if you want, that these matters are very important, and having research that is adequate in order to provide at least partially answers to this kind of complex research question is very important. And that's why we gathered relevant speakers that are involved in frontier research on these matters to present papers and discuss on methodological problems, results, and what is useful to do, also to have a good way ahead in terms of this research trend. Tomorrow morning's panel, as you have seen from the program, is an attempt to, in a way, take stock of, at least partly, of 20 or 30 years maybe of important literature in economics about the impact of technological change on jobs and on incomes. It's not necessary that I mention David Authors, Daron Acemoglu, and all the others that gave rise to a very huge stream of literature concerning the impact of technological change on jobs and on incomes. And our idea tomorrow is, again, with an interdisciplinary take, but not only, also putting in comparison different theoretical approaches and empirical approaches in economics in order to see how we can build a kind of complete figure, even in theoretical terms, to deal with, from an economic and sociological perspective, the impact of technological change on labor markets. And in the afternoon, the two panels, let's say, or the panel divided in two that we have organized for the tomorrow's afternoon, we will have a set of let's say empirical, but some of those will have strong theoretical basis as well, but contributions reporting fresh evidence on the impact of technological change and specific elements of technological change on employment and income. And the idea is also to have papers that allow us to compare how in different countries, with different institutional setup, with different characteristics in structural terms, we might observe different effects of technological change on the variable that we are interested in. And so the idea is to have a discussion on these papers that can provide also sound feedbacks to the authors and to the develop their research, and of course is a very important opportunity for us to show some of the research that in INAPP we are developing, and that will be of course enriched by the discussion and the confrontation with external researcher and international in particular that can provide us important feedbacks to enrich and to ameliorate our research. So I think that I'm perfectly on time to start at 11 the first panel of this conference as planned. So just let me thank very much all the colleagues of the research unit that I coordinate, skills and labor market transition, Francesca, Monica, and people who worked hard in organizational terms in order to allow us to do the things that we are doing today. So thank you very much, and I invite the speakers of the first panel to come and join us, and so we can start our conference. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much. I will try to speak first a little bit in English and then in Italian, just to not to bother too much the audience. But first of all, let's say thank you very much to INAPP, which allow us to present this book, which is this one, basically. Florian, this is the book, right? It is, yeah. This is the book, which is, as you can see, a very, very big book, which is the result of a longer research than the group, which is part around this table, made on the technological transformation and what's happened in the term of labor, employment, industrial relation, and so on. I'm very pleased that INAPP allow the possibility to present in this conference the book, which I think is a good exercise on different multidimensional analysis of what is work in this new digital age. Is obviously, as you can see or you will read on the book, then there is a part of this book which is made throughout a clear policy agenda, or give the idea to a clear policy agenda. But I think the more important thing is the book is based on the analysis, on the deep work of different countries in Europe, and not only in Europe, made a clear statement of what is exactly the digital age and what does it mean, differences in the country, how does it affect a little bit all employment, industrial relation, and also wages and society. Then I think is a good exercise to present that at the beginning of the conference, because give a clear landscape on where is the challenges, as they say, of the new industrial revolution, which is quite clear now, at least in the general analysis. Then, as I say at the beginning, that technological growth or technological changes make certainly economic growth. What is the problem? Does make also social growth or wage growth or job growth. That is the point of discussion. And basically, given the result in the last years of what's happened in the society, what is quite clear is more inequality or more distance between jobs or more distance between people, which is the result of this work. And I think that just to open the floor, I can give the floor to Florian, just to give us his opinion, his feeling about the research and the book. And after that, to Max, perhaps, and then we open the discussion on that.
Well, thank you so much, Paolo, and thank you so much for having us. It's a great pleasure being here, especially with having a number of authors and contributors of the book on the panel today. So as how we'll go ahead, I will kind of like give you an idea of the main themes of the book. So that's kind of like, you know, the theory in our today's kind of like, you know, panel. And then we will have, we will explore in more detail in the empirical part. We have Jean and Carlotta, who will be able to kind of like give us a more detailed picture on what's happening in Italy and in Ireland. And then we also have Georgios with us, who's sort of the expert on artificial intelligence, so kind of like the next thing and the kind of like, you know, next big cornerstone in this debate. And maybe just to map out kind of like, you know, how we got the idea of the book. It was about 3 or 4 years ago now that the contributors kind of like came together and noticed that in specific countries, so I'm based in the UK, for instance, and Max is based in Germany, working in the labor ministry at the time, we had very different conversation in these countries of what technological change looks like and what the social implications and the implications for the workforce are in each of these countries. In the UK, the discourse was very much driven by the departure of Uber and Deliveroo, so the so-called platform or gig economy. And the question there were very much around, you know, how these new gig workers fit into the existing labor laws and regulations, while in Germany at the time the White Book was being produced by the labor ministry, which didn't just look into the different kind of works or types of work that are emerging through new technologies, but also looked into social partnerships, looked into the quality of work, and so forth. And the idea of the book was to bring the thinking on this topic together, but also bring it, do a number of empirical and case studies from experts, labor market experts who work in the field and who have the insights also on the policy discourses and debates in each of the countries. So I'll give you a very brief, so to speak, theoretical introduction with the main themes of the book. And here in the deep dive part, so in the first part of the book, by the way, you can download it for free on our website, on the Policy Network website, but also on Das Progressive Zentrum. So it's not just physical, it's truly kind of like digital and technological, and you can download the whole book for free and can use it for your research purposes. So in the first part of the book, there are 3 themes in this kind of like deep dive section. And here we started with the conversation about the 4th industrial revolution. So what does it actually mean? Is it actually happening? And how does it differ from previous technological changes? But we also asked the question, what are the broader implications of new technologies on the economy, the way how we create value, on productivity issues, but also what does it mean for wages? And not unsurprisingly, one of the contributors in the book, Luc Soete, basically argues, well, you know, the discourse on new technologies and the degree of disruption and the fears and anxiety about technological change are very similar to what we experienced previously in the 1970s and 80s, for instance, but also even earlier in the 1920s and 30s. So the idea of robots taking over our jobs and people losing, you know, being kind of like becoming unemployed has been around for a while. But what we find also throughout the contributions in the book is that what's new and what's different now is that this is taking place at a much faster rate. So technology nowadays is having a more profound impact on the way how we work and the way how work is organized, but also the way how our economies work. But there is kind of like most of the authors of the book kind of like point out and kind of like allude to the fact that the technological change can only come about with social and political change. So for instance, if we take, you know, autonomous vehicles as an example, yes, well, where we see, well, the technology exists and is in place already, and we could probably have autonomous cars driving on our roads. We are not there yet in terms of the regulatory framework, which means there are questions. I mean, just if we have a look on what's been reported in Tesla in the US. There are security issues, there are issues about moral and ethical questions, the way of how machines work and possibly even think. So for us and for society and the policymakers, the task there is first to make technology work for society and for people first. So all the kind of like debate about change and kind of like how rapid this change will come will also largely depend on the policy conversations and the policy discourse we have in each of these countries. That kind of like brings us to the second theme of this kind of like more macro perspective, which are the insecurities and anxieties caused by the debate on the automation of work. And here, I guess the seminal study is the one by Fry and Osborne in 2013, which first kind of like brought to the public debate the kind of like potential impact of technology on our workforce. And there they cited, or they came to the conclusion that for the US labor market, 47% of jobs are at risk of being automated. Now, this was a really good conversation starter, not just in the academic world, but also in society and in politics. But as we know now, and there's a really good contribution by Melanie Arntz and colleagues in the book, we now have a broader variety of studies that looks from a different methodological but also empirical angle on this topic, and which derives at much lower numbers. For instance, the contribution in the book there, Melanie Arntz don't just look at the automation of jobs themselves, but they're considering the automation and substitution of tasks, and they arrive at a figure which is much lower. So for the OECD, they calculate that it's between, or the automation potential is between 9 and 12%. And interestingly, it's Germany which finds itself at the higher end, at the 12% threshold, where jobs are at risk of being automated. And here, I guess another question in this context is, what impact will new technologies have on different economic models? So whether, such in the case of Germany, your economy is still kind of like running on high steam when it comes to manufacturing jobs, especially in the automotive and engineering industry, or whether it's more kind of like whether your economy is such, as in the UK or the Netherlands, are already highly matured and developed on providing or mainly maintaining the service sector. And there, I guess this is the third take from this macro perspective here, which is pointed out in most of the contribution is, and which is quite critical for thinking about and approaching this topic of the impact of technology on work, is that the underlying sort of foundation of our economic model are changing. And here, most of the authors point out that data and networks are the new resource of the future, and the new resource, especially when it comes to value creation in our economies. And there we also already have some great empirical work, which is not in the book, but which is done by the authors, or which has been published by Westlake and Professor Haskell, which look into, it's called Capitalism Without Capital. And there the authors look into how our economies are increasingly built on intangible assets and investments. So that means we're moving away from producing and investing in kind of like physical goods, so things that you can drop on your kind of like feet, but kind of like more developed economies are increasingly investing in intangible assets, so software, data, network, and so on. And I guess a good example, which is also in the book, is kind of like the transformation of the business model that Rolls-Royce used to have. I'm sure you're all aware of what they do. They build like, mainly, or their core business is building big kind of like engines for the airplane, or for airplanes and the airplane industry. And instead of just selling a physical good to their customers, they nowadays sell aviation hours to their customers. So that means they don't just sell a physical good, but they also sell along the services that come along with maintaining this physical good and kind of like servicing the customer. And for that, they need networks. For that, they need the data to kind of like survey, you know, how the engines are running, what are the stats and everything. And it's quite interesting to take it from that perspective. So these are the three main kind of like macro themes that are developed throughout the book. There are two other ones, and I'll speed up a little bit because I'm running out of time. So apart from these macro perspectives, there are quite a number of chapters who look on the specific impact of new technologies on the workforce. And there we have, and Georgios will tell us more about that when we talk about artificial intelligence. And there we have, for instance, the potential of furthering the dualization of European labor markets, which means, broadly speaking, that through technologies, we're losing middle-income jobs, and we're adding especially jobs, low-paid, low-productivity jobs on the one end of the spectrum, and high-paid, highly skilled, highly productive jobs on the other end of the spectrum. This is also mainly backed up by some of the data we found on Eurofound for the European labor market, especially for the time after the financial crisis until around 2015. But what we also see in the data is that this had recently this has bounced back, and we also, apart from adding jobs, kind of like low-paid and high-skilled jobs, we're also adding mid-income jobs in Europe again, which again here, and you'll have Alan Manning telling you all about this tomorrow, also about the link between technology and losing out middle-income jobs. But again here, there is a political question to it, and I think there's not enough analysis done on that part, that through the more flexible labor markets, and especially through some of the kind of like the push of the European Union post-financial crisis in Southern Europe, but also in other European countries, we've seen more flexible labor markets which have allowed the widening or the increase of low-paid jobs in Europe. And this is very closely connected, this debate, with the theme and the topic on the digital platforms. And here, two authors in the book, Stefano and de Burg, argue that what we essentially see is with new digital platforms such as Uber, such as Deliveroo, and so on, we don't really think anything new or innovative or technological. Yes, the application itself is, you know, a new kind of like piece of technology. But what we see is we see a rebranding of casual work within the economy, which means that people are kind of like being forced into low-paid jobs through new technology. And I guess here it's quite important, or it's a really important debate also to have in the academic space, you know, what this means. And just very lastly, a last point on social welfare, which is the sort of third part of our theoretical chapters, which looks at social welfare and social partnerships. So who are the new actors in the space? And there's a big debate about, also in the book, and we see that in the empirical chapters as well, there's a big debate about kind of like the role of social partnerships and the role that trade unions can play in this process, especially representing or increasing bargaining powers of workers who are employed or who work through these digital platforms. And interestingly, I can explore that also in the discussion. There's a chapter on the UK, but also on Slovenia, which kind of like comes to the conclusion that there's a new form of grassroots trade unions emerging, which are sort of also organized through social media and Facebook, and who represent these workers on digital platforms, and then get some support from established trade unions who help them out mainly in law cases. And yeah, the second big theme or part when we talk about social welfare is obviously what does this all mean for our social welfare models in Europe? but what does this also mean in terms of here, especially active labor market policies? So if people are to lose jobs and are being, if jobs are being automated, how can these institutions that we have in place in Europe be replaced or reformed? And also, to what extent is there a debate necessary on the European level, so on the EU level, with a hint to kind of like the European social pillar of what that role might look like on a European level? But I'll leave it with that and pass over to Max, who will present you some of the kind of like recommendations and policies. So we do policies first, and then we come back to the empirical part. Thank you.
Hello, yeah. So, buongiorno tutti, mille grazie a Dario e Ina per l'invitazione. It's always a pleasure to be in Rome. So, when you compile an edited volume, as we did, of more than 600 pages, you always come up with the question, so what does it all mean, right? So you have all these kind of contributions, and what does this mean? So,
like the Brexit agreement.
Exactly. So, please allow me to rather have the perspective of a policy advisor, someone who's trying to make sense of all this academic work for people who actually work in government or different kind of public institutions. Could you put up the presentation? Perfect. So that's what I'm basically trying to do, like in the next 7 minutes or so, to briefly outline what we saw as the main takeaways for policymakers. And I think one of the most important takeaways is one about discourse. How I look at the digitalization debate globally at the moment is, it's quite interesting to see that digitalization turned from something that we do to something that is done to us. So basically, we now see digitalization as something which is exogenous, and the only thing you can do as a country, as a policymaker, as a government, is basically to adapt to this change coming from the external. And I think that's kind of a false conceptualization. So the first thing really is to have the right maps, as I would call it, to really try to understand how is the economic and societal landscape changing because of technological change, but to what extent are we ourselves as policymakers, as companies, as employees, as trade unionists, as all different kind of stakeholders of a society actually shaping this landscape. I think this is like a very, very important map to start with. Then secondly, I mean, all the debate about how do we adapt to digitalization is basically about skills, right? And whoever you talk to, it would always be about, okay, now we have to teach our kids how to code, and everyone has to have digital skills. I mean, yes, that's true. It's true that people will have a different kind of skill set in the future. But I think what's more important as a takeaway is firstly to look at fundamental skills, because what we see, the main inhibitor to the development of digital skills is the lack of fundamental skills. And fundamental skills is about, like calculating, speaking, basic reasoning, these kind of things. So this means for policymakers, the first step always is to invest in fundamental skills, and then you can think about digital skills. Only investing in digital skills will not work out. Secondly, I think the skill issue is about what is going to be genuinely human in the future. For every kind of occupation you have, be that a nurse, a professor, or a politician, there will be one part of the job that will be automatized by advanced technologies. There will be a part of the job where the human being will be augmented by technology, but there will always be a third part of the occupation where the human is genuinely in place, right? And that could be about empathy, about creativity, all different kind of issues. And I think we have to analyze on a societal level, on an organizational level, and on an individual level, what part of jobs, what part of occupations, what part of different sectors of our economy, where do we see automation, where do we see augmentation, and where do we see genuine human activities. Third part is about building institutions that foster employability and guarantee secure transitions. I mean, 20 years ago, we had this debate in Europe about flexicurity, right? So how do you combine flexibility and security? And particularly in the progressive sphere, flexicurity became kind of a bad term. So if you say flexicurity, that is considered to be something neoliberal. But I think in its original meaning, this term basically fits to the world of work we will see in the future, right? So I think we will see a world of work in the future where people will change jobs more frequently over the life course. And it's not so much about protecting jobs, but more about protecting people and finding the right institutions that people can make a transition from one job to the other, which is not only a transition, but a good transition. And I think a major challenge for policymakers is to find the right institutions to basically deliver on this task, to basically provide secure transitions from one good job to another good job. For the case of Germany, where I'm from, we are thinking about, like a right to continuous education, for example, and turning the kind of employment agency into an agency for employment and qualification. So the same kind of institution we used to go to say, hey, I basically lost my job, can I have a new one, is now an institution where you go and say, I'm working in this or that occupation, and I see kind of in the nearer future, my job might risk automation. Where can I go with the kind of skill set I have, right? So you basically have to develop your institutions to be institutions that cater to this kind of aim, which is providing employability and secure transitions. Fourthly, the whole debate about the gig economy, the Ubers, the Fedoras, all these kind of companies Florian talked about, I would say platform companies are not a bad thing in themselves, right? I mean, you have low productivity sectors, more people may work in low productivity sectors, and platforms are a good way to use efficiency potentials in low productivity sectors. But in our setting of European societies, the standard employment relationship comes with some social rights attached, right? And the problem is more the erosion of these social rights. So the question is, how can you transform our system of social rights in a way that people work in the gig economy can also enjoy these social rights? And I think basically there are three different things you can do, right? So one approach would be to fight, let's say, employment models where the company says this is independent employment, but the governing bodies, the government says, no, this is dependent employment, right? So you basically fight the false classification of dependent employees as independent employees. That's the first solution. The other one would be to say, well, basically, these are independent workers. We only have to extend social rights to these independent workers, right? That's like another approach. There's also a third approach, which is discussed about in the UK and in the US, particularly, which is about coming up with a third category. So do we kind of build a new category between dependent and independent employment? So, for example, a dependent contractor as a solution. From my personal perspective, the big risk with this third approach is that you might see an erosion of dependent employment with all the social rights attached to this new category of dependent contractors, for example. But I think this is kind of a decision governments have to make in Europe. Number 5 is about tackling income and wealth inequality. I mean, it doesn't really matter what kind of scenario you take, what kind of macroeconomic model you run, the technological transformation of our labor markets will hit on those with low skills in a particularly hard way. And there is a tendency you see in the US, like superstar firms, winner takes it all these kind of mechanisms, and we increasingly see this in Europe as well. So we see a widening gap in wealth and in income as well. And the question is, how do you basically tackle that? And I think there are, there's kind of, so to say, there's like a small social question and a big social question. The small social question would be about how do we adapt our tax code, this kind of issue. The bigger one is a more, let's say, paradigmatic one, which is about, is it actually the right approach to tax dependent employment in an age of technological change? Or shouldn't we rather move towards taxing more heavily capital gains, what have you, yeah, like inheritance tax, all these kind of issues. And I think you have to have both conversations at the same time, right? I think we have to adapt our tax code in an incremental way, which is kind of the small social question, but we also have a debate about the bigger social question, which is like the big paradigm of how do we distribute efficiency gains, productivity gains in our society. And also the issue of ownership, right? I think that's a quite important one, because at the moment we have the perception that the digital age only comes in two flavors, right? So the Silicon Valley flavor and the Shenzhen, the Chinese flavor, so to say. And to me, it's quite important to say that, you know, technology is mainly about building blocks, right, like Legos. And you can construct different kind of business models, different kind of societal or economic models with the same kind of building blocks. And you don't have this kind of determinism where digital technologies can only lead to business models or societal models in the, you know, Shenzhen or the Silicon Valley way. So there is like a European way, but the question is, what does this mean in a concrete manner? And I think like in Europe, we do have a rich tradition of cooperatives, for example, right? Like Mondragon in Spain, so cooperative structures. You have this like in northern Italy as well. And I think we have to build on this rich tradition of more cooperative ways of organizing economic actors to basically come up with a European way of running a digital economy. And that's something we can elaborate on in the discussion, I think. Then what's the role of the state, right? I mean, when you look at China, when you look at the US, what you see is, or at Israel as well, you see that the state has a massive role as a lead investor, right? So the state is basically pushing forward the technological transformation of society and the economy. And particularly in Germany, the term industrial policy used to be a bad one, right? You don't do industrial policy. You don't meddle with how the economy is developing. And I do see a change in Germany particularly, but in other European countries as well. So there's kind of a renaissance of industrial policy, and I think that's a good thing. But it should be like smart industrial policy, and then you can debate what is smart industrial policy. But I think the whole argument being developed by Mariana Mazzucato about mission-led innovation is quite important. And looking at Germany again, we do have this debate at the moment, you know, like China is ahead on AI, China is ahead on blockchain, all these kind of issues. And what we have to do as Germans is to keep up, right? Now we have to develop AI as well. And we don't really ask the question, what for? So what do we want to develop AI for? What do we want to develop blockchain for? What do we want to develop big data? You know, here, data as a public good. What do you want to develop these kind of technologies for? And I think that's something where France, for example, is leading the way. I mean, their AI strategy is really pointing out what are the big missions we want to work on in health, in transportation, in sustainability, and we want to use technology to work towards these kind of missions. And I think that's a good way to go. That's where the technological and the economical really meets the political. I mean, when you look at the Appalachian region in the US, when you look at the Mezzogiorno, when you look at Eastern Germany, you see that technology can be a catalyst for widening regional gaps, but it also has the potential to be a catalyst for closing these regional gaps. And that's something that's not super, you know, like hip and chic to do as a policymaker, you know, like to work on regional development. That's kind of, you know, some kind of nitty-gritty stuff. But I think it's super, super important. And I think European countries should engage in a more intense debate. How do you do regional development in a good way in the age of digital transformation? And then lastly, I think what we do have to do is to have a conversation about a good working society where work is not only considered to be dependent employment for money, but also, you know, like care work, civic engagement, all different kind of activities. I mean, I'm not really fond of all these, you know, we are running out of work, we need a universal basic income arguments, because I do see us as an active society with human beings as being active in this society. But it's, you know, a rich plurality of activities people engage in a society. And the real question for policymakers on a more, you know, normative level is how do we conceptualize a good working society where a good life consists of different kind of activities, be that employment, civic engagement, care work, caring for the elderly, all these kind of issues. And I think you have to do both at the same time. You really do have to have more like an engineering approach on labor market economy, like labor market policies, social policies, but you also do have to engage in this kind of a discourse. What is a good working society? That's it from my side. Thank you.
Very good, very good, very good, because I think there are a lot of points to discuss, but as Florence said before the discussion, perhaps, which will open a lot of questions, perhaps we go back to the fundamental theoretical of the book, and then I will ask Georg Petropoulos to do some about artificial intelligence, since that was one of the points discussed in the Max presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
First of all, I wrote one chapter in this book, but when I saw the book printed, I was really impressed from the quality of the contributions and the diversity of the contributions also. So I would like to warmly congratulate the editors for this book, and I strongly encourage you to read it since also it is available for free online. So my contribution has to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning. The first starting point is how automation affects employment. And theoretical developments have reached a consensus that there are two different opposing broad effects. The one is that automation can displace workers. I develop a machine that does a specific job task better than a human being, more efficiently, so I prefer the machine to do the task instead of labor. But on the other hand, these efficiency gains can bring some productivity gains. And these productivity gains can come in a form of increasing the opportunities of labor in non-automated tasks, but also creating new tasks, new opportunities for employment. Going to the previous industrial revolution, one of the big advances was the automation of urban transportation. We introduced automobiles in the market, so some employment opportunities in horse-related jobs diminished, as it was natural, because automobiles were much more efficient. And while in the short term that may have a negative impact on employment opportunities, in the long run, when we manage to take the advantage of the efficiency gains that automobile brought, we saw a big employment opportunities. That could go in engineering, that could go in paid driving urban transportation services, that could go in food industry, which could develop and offer new services for car drivers, that could go in construction of big networks of roads. So by looking in the past, what we see the short-run effect, that it is the displacement that it is promoted, and the long-run effect that it is these productivity gains that come back and may they affect positively this relationship. So the question is, which of the two effects dominate? Using recent data on industrial robots, and industrial robots are defined as automatically controlled, reprogrammable, and multi-purpose robots that have been introduced to European industries. What we did was the following exercise. We tried to assess the impact of the introduction of industrial robots to the European industries, and we did it in two different time windows. The one was checking the impact of robots in the change of employment rate for different regions of Europe, adopting a regional approach from 95 to 2007, and the second from 95 to 2015. So the overall period, the 95-2015, we see a positive impact. There is a positive correlation between the introduction of robots and the employment rate. But if we had focused on 2007-95 period, then the impact was either not important or even negative. And what happened between 2007 and 2015? And what we have seen is that, first of all, robots became much more efficient because as of the end of 2000 decade, we had the implementation of machine learning algorithms on how robots operate, and that could create higher efficiencies. And that brought us to a situation in which, if we compare the productivity effect and the displacement effect, the two opposing effects that automation brings, we see that the productivity effects dominates between the two. However, we do that by using data until now. The crucial question is what will happen from now on. As machine learning is advancing and artificial intelligence technologies are introduced in our everyday life and in our production process, what we see first of all is a fundamental shift of employment opportunities to service sector. But this does not mean that it is the end of the debate. The question is whether these intelligent machines will steal our jobs or not. And by doing that, by running this exercise, the first thing we need to ask is, what is the current status of these machines? How can they compete with human beings or not? And if we go to the next slide, do I have the? Oh, great! I have only 2 slides, so yeah. So what we see is that machine learning has particularly advanced in 4 different dimensions. The one is the object detection. So you throw to the AI system different images, and the AI system put it in categories. And then you calculate the error rate in this exercise. And as of 2015, AI system performed better than human beings in that. So the error rate that the machine has in classifying different images is smaller than human beings. In speech recognition, another exercise is to let the machine learning system to recognize different speeches and put them in different categories. And then we see that in 2017, the AI systems reach the human ability to do that. So a human translation, again, is something that we see in advantages of machine learning. So we have an idea where the machine learning systems can beat human beings. And also, but a general underlying principle is that there is an exponential growth in the efficiency of these systems, and even in other more complicated problems like question answering or visual question answering by seeing an image and answer a quiz related to this image, we see that the machine learning systems are advanced a lot. They haven't reached so far the ability of humans, but this is something that will happen in the future. So by saying that, I return back to the question, so is this the end of human employment? And the answer that I have is no. Because we need to understand what is machine learning and artificial intelligence. So basically, in the base of these new intelligence machines, we have an algorithm in which we have some input, some training data, and this training data is used in order to derive a particular output. So what we need is a learning function from the input and the output. And the machines usually, at the first time that they do that really bad. But then through machine learning techniques, they learn to become better, 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 and you have this exponential growth in their efficiency. So the important thing is, the important question to ask is what job tasks will be affected by that. And for this, we need to, researchers have established 8 criteria. The one is to have a well-established learning function from the input of the algorithm to the output. The other is to have available data in order the machine to be trained and become better. then we need to have clearly definable goals on what are the objectives of the task, which is not always the case. And also, machines will do very poorly if they to perform a task, they need to go through a very long chain of reasoning and logic with different contingencies in order to arrive to the output. And of course, if in a task we need to have a detailed explanation of how the output was derived, again, machines will do very poorly. Another point of view is the tolerance of error. If, for example, error is strictly costly and we want to avoid it, imagine, for example, a human operation for a brain tumor. What machines could do is could help, but you always need a human operator to do that. They cannot do that by themselves. And another dimension is that so far robotics have been proved very helpful, but haven't been very helpful in a very constrained environment. I go from place A to place B. So that is a channel when we are moving to self-driving and connected cars, actually. So what we expect is that if the task, the job task, in the performance of the job task, we need elaborated physical skills and mobility, that is something that also make machines more difficult to exceed the ability of human beings. But what I did in the previous 3-4 minutes is I was talking all the time about tasks, and that is very important. Machines can operate a particular function, a particular task. They cannot, they cannot perform a whole occupation. If we look at the occupation is composed by different tasks. And there is in some occupation, there is a great diversity between tasks. For example, consider a lawyer. We have some tasks on paperwork, preparing a contract, checking a contract. Some lawyers in some countries also, they act as official translators, but they also have to go to the court and defend their clients. So we could expect that AI system will help lawyers in the performance of the paperwork tasks, but it will be much more difficult to go in front of the court and the judge and defend a client. So the efficiency that we can have in this way is that the lawyer can use AI systems to do more efficient their paperwork and focus closely to the tasks that cannot be operated by machines so well. So moving forward, we need to adopt a task-based approach. The Frey and Osborne result is deriving predictions over occupations. But as Florian mentioned, if we go to a task-based approach, the result is the risk is much smaller. There are also many benefits to be gained. The problem is that as empirical scientists do not have data on the future, it is difficult to assess it. So that's a qualitative analysis of what machines can do and what are the trends of machine learning and artificial intelligence system is one way to proceed and identify what are the involved risks. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Georgios. It was quite an interesting view of artificial intelligence, which has changed probably very much our landscape in between manufacturing and services, the way in which we produce. Then we move a little bit to the cross-country comparison. The book did a division of the different country between low density, high density, medium density. As usual, Italy is in the low ranking as a low density country, but doesn't matter. This is not a main focus. But I will ask Florian, before give the floor to Sean and Carlotta, how you work on this sharing of country, how the country have been divided, regarding which indicator and why you did that. Florian, first.
So yeah, no, just very briefly, because it kind of like helped us with structuring, the case studies. We use the Digital Economy and Society Index, so data that's available or made available by the UK Commission, and which ranks, or which gives an indication of where countries or how countries perform in a number of kind of like digital categories. We there have kind of like, connectivity, so the access to broadband. We have kind of like, they call it digital capital, so the kind of like human capital, which covers more broadly, the skills that are available, within the workforce, and a number of other categories. I think it was quite striking is, I mean, with Ireland and Italy, we have a relatively highly performing or high performing country, with Ireland, which belongs to kind of like the top group, but we also find, I mean, these are just indicators, right? We find Italy slightly further down in the ranking. But I think what was striking was that in this category, and I think this is not just an empirical observation, but also maybe a question to answer and to study in more detail. And our other co-editor, Jacqueline O'Reilly, is really interested in that question, for instance, how the Scandinavian countries, so here we have Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, plus the Netherlands, are really kind of like on a different level when it comes to these performance indicators than the rest of Europe. Even, some of the big economies, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, are really not doing that well, but these 4 countries are doing something very special. And I think from a research perspective, this is quite interesting to look into in more detail. But, having said that, I'd just like to give over to Jean or to start with the Irish case.
Thanks, Florian. Sean. First and Carlotta.
Okay, thanks very much to Florian and Max and Jacqueline for the invitation to participate in the book. I can't make any claims for my own chapter, but I was commenting that it is maybe as long as the Brexit agreement, but it's a little easier to read, so it is quite accessible. So I want to talk a little bit about my own stuff around Ireland, but also, I suppose, I can make some comments around the Nordic models and Denmark in particular as I go through. And in part, I just wanted to address some of the general questions, and 3 key questions in particular. What is happening? What is the effect of technology on work? We've heard it around employment and so on. And if the effects on employment are kind of open, then what are some of the trends we see in this kind of restructuring of work? The second kind of big question is around the national models, and what do these national models look like? I might briefly comment on Japan, but maybe compare Denmark and Ireland. And then just maybe a few comments at the end about what are the social and political effects, and is there a connection between these kinds of changes and the kind of political backlash that we perhaps notice these days? And as I go through, I'll just make reference to some research we've done using the European Foundation working conditions surveys, and also some interview work we've done in Denmark and in Ireland. But just, you'll have to take me, I'll give you no evidence, you just have to take me at my word for it. So I suppose on the first question, in terms of work and employment, and I completely agree with the discussion to date in the sense that really the key issue is what happens in services. And, in a sense, there's a lot of discussion about technology and manufacturing, but manufacturing employment peaked, probably 50, 60 years ago. So really, the key issue is what is going to happen around services. And I'm recently read a very interesting paper by a young sociologist, Benjamin Shostakovsky, about software automation. And he talked about how a software tech startup in the US had actually, over the course of the development of its software, ended up combining different combinations of kind of automation, but then also reconfiguring that technology over time to combine it with emotional labor, given that users were unable to use the technology and so on. So even this question of, what tasks get automated and how they get recombined with other kinds of work, I think is very open and both complex but also open to be shaped in terms of societal choices and political choices. But I think we can see some trends when we look at work today, and we looked at this in the working conditions survey and looked at what was the work, if people said just a very basic indicator, if people said they used a computer at work, what was that associated with? And oftentimes, most of the time, people who use a computer at work are working in what we might think of as better jobs, more autonomy in work, more chance to learn on the job and so on. So in that sense, we could think about those jobs as they're typically moving beyond the kind of classic simple jobs with very little autonomy and learning, or even Taylorism with a lot of assembly line and so on, to either lean production, which has a lot of worker input but is highly controlled, or learning work, where workers have more autonomy. So you see a lot more of those. If you use a computer at work, you're more likely to be in lean or learning jobs. So far, so good. But then, in general, within those jobs, if you are using a computer, you tend to be working under more pressurized, intense environments. So it's a combination of kind of the upgrading of work, but also the intensification of work. And this looks different in different countries, but the general tendency seems to be in that direction. And then the third kind of element of that we see is not so much that necessarily the middle is getting hollowed out, but that if you were in the bottom third of the labour market, the requirements to get to those middle and higher jobs have become much more demanding in terms of education, soft skills, all these kinds of things, the need to learn at work on a consistent basis and so on. So that really shows up in Ireland because you have overall an upgrading of employment, more technology use, more professional jobs and so on. But if you are stuck in the bottom of the labour market, those jobs remain very little opportunities to learn, very little access to technology and so on. So we have a kind of a low learning trap, which is the focus of my chapter. So you can have all of these things, and this is within Europe, so you can have all of these things happening at the same time. Improvements in work going along with intensification, and in a sense the cliff, if you don't manage to get into the better part of the labour market, the cliff to fall into the secondary labour market is a lot more severe. So I think that's kind of the general tendencies. If we think about then the second question, which is what are the different national models around this? And I think one of the questions that Paolo posed was, what's the difference between the changes in this information revolution and in the industrial revolution? And one way to think about that is in terms of the technology, in terms of what kinds of things are being automated. So it's not so much that maybe in the industrial revolution new people were brought into the market economy. Today, in a sense, we're already in that market economy, but new aspects of our lives are being brought into it. The car we drive, the parking space, all these kinds of things being monetized and so on. But probably I think the bigger issue is that this information revolution is taking place after the welfare state, after the large corporation, after the rise of global markets. So in a sense, it is happening on a very different institutional and political terrain than the Industrial Revolution did. So that makes a huge difference in terms of these kind of political choices. So, what does this look like in different countries? And, really, I think the automation trajectory is really shaped by the social and political model within different countries. So I think, an extreme case in a sense is Japan, which faces all kinds of, is very heavily focused on automation and robotics. Why is it so heavily focused on automation and robotics? Just a short analysis would be that it refuses to deal with many other issues that could, social issues that could solve the questions they have around low birth rate and so on. So it doesn't really change gender relations, keeps immigration very low, and doesn't do much to address long working hours. Those three things together are probably, much bigger issues than automation. So in a sense, Japan is in a sense focused on automation because it isn't tackling those other social and political issues. And it's hard to, I don't think you can understand its focus on robotics without understanding all the other social issues it's trying to address or not address. But I suppose more substantively, I just wanted to say a little bit about the Nordics and Ireland. So the Nordics are the kind of high-density superstars of technology adoption, and Ireland is this kind of medium density, is doing quite well. But in a sense, Ireland's technology adoption has happened mainly through foreign investment. So it's been quite focused on bringing in a high-tech sector, and then the diffusion out from this high-tech sector out to the rest of the society has been much weaker. Whereas the Nordics, clearly it's a much more diffused model of technology adoption. So, one of the things that struck us in our research in Denmark is that technology adoption is normalized. It's not that there's no conflict, but really, it's expected that new technology will be adopted, and the politics is around adjustment to that rather than whether it is adopted or not. So how is that possible? And I think you can look at different aspects of the Nordic model and see, what are some of the kind of conditions that facilitate that. So I just want to mention 4 different levels, and then I'm probably going to have used up my time. So I think going from the macro down to the micro, at the most general level, the welfare model, the Nordic welfare model, on the one hand, it provides the need for productivity increases. You have to pay for it somehow. It also gives you the investment in the kinds of things that Max was talking about, taking basic education, child development and so on very seriously. And it also provides an element of compensation for the dislocation of workers, etc. So in that sense, kind of a service-rich welfare state is well suited to this kind of highly automated economy. So Ireland, by contrast, Ireland spends quite a bit on social welfare, but most of it is in the form of cash transfers. So what we tend to have is very high levels of market inequality that we then spend a lot of cash reducing the income inequality, but without really providing the services to address the root cause of the inequality. So in that sense, it's a generous welfare state, but it operates very differently from the Danish model. The service-intensive welfare state is more effective in terms of this information level. Secondly, at the tech sector level, I mentioned this earlier, but tech in Denmark is generalized beyond the tech sector. So in that sense, the most important technology sectors in Denmark, in terms of technology and intensity and so on, are really not high-tech sectors. They're things like wind energy, for example. So very high levels of, technological capacity. There's much higher levels of technological capacity in the wind industry than in the software app, whatever you put on this to buy whatever it is when you're walking around town. This is relatively simple in technological terms compared to the systems that control wind energy and so on. Whereas in Ireland, it's more segmented within the foreign investment sector. Then at the level of the labour market, when we look at different kinds of work organisation, the Nordic countries have very, very low levels of people working in simple or tailorless jobs with very little worker autonomy and learning. And you could say, why are there so few of those jobs? And the main reason is not so much regulation, but that most of those jobs are done through the public sector. So that is actually linked to having a large public sector. So we can think of childcare. So childcare in Ireland, for example, is provided through the private sector, subsidised with state payments to parents. And what that tends to produce is high inequalities in childcare and relatively poor jobs in childcare, as childcare providers are under big cost pressures and so on. In Denmark, it's a public service that then, there's improved work conditions and so on. And then the last one is just at the level of work organisation itself, industrial relations and so on, and that there tends to, all other things being equal, workplaces in Denmark are less hierarchical than in Ireland, and there's more focus on learning organisations than lean organisations. Now, I do have to say, in Denmark, I think there's a big debate about work intensification, and that seems to be one of the major pressures. So that's really just this kind of national model, and I think, again, you know, part of the national model, the differences in the national models are how do they cope with specific technologies, but it's also about the broader features of the tech sector, the welfare model, and so on. And I think I'll leave it there, and we can discuss the other issues later.
Thank you very much, Sean. Carlotta on the Italian case.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I'd like to take the opportunity today to speak about the situation in Italy, but also to pick up some points and comment some points that Max made. There is a famous bestseller. The title is Who Moved My Cheese? And it's a tale of three mice who used to, you know, were in a kind of in the back of a maze and could just have infinite cheese, and they kept on eating, eating, and eating. And at some point, the cheese ended. And it's a story of how the three mice dealt with the complete disappearance of cheese. So two mice stay there and wait for the cheese to, you know, grow again. And the third mice entered the maze, took a risk, and arrived at the end of the maze where he found new cheese. So you have two mice stayed there and died, and one mouse just went through the maze. And the reason why I'm telling this story is because I think the debate, well, in Italy, I don't even know if, through the media or even at government level, we ever started this discussion on the future of work. It's funny because if you walk in an airport in London, you find these big signs, have you imagined the future of work? When here in Italy seems to be the debate is completely absent. And Italy has this tendency of waking up all of a sudden. So we woke up all of a sudden with the situation of banks, and we thought that our banks were, you know, the best in the world, and all of a sudden, within 1 year, savers lost 30 billion euros. When Tito Boeri tried to have this concept of, the orange sheets to provide people information on their pension, he was really attacked, and I would say even he found a lot of resistance in the country. I think Italians, both politicians, policymakers, academics, and even the media should be a little more vocal and a little more focused on this issue. A point I'd like to make is I was 1 year ago in a seminar, close-ended seminar, and a former representative of Confindustria, now he's a senior official, he's just having more institutional roles. He had just came back from the US right after the Trump election. And in this closed seminar, he said, I gathered this information in the US, it looks like Trump called up Google, and I don't really understand why he called up Google to ask to slow down on these cars or machines that drive by themselves. And I raised my hand and I said, the reason why he called up, and it was one of the first calls that he made, is because in the US, the truck drivers are 3 million people, and they represent the one biggest constituency in middle class. So they're the biggest category, right? So the first call was to the technology company that could jeopardize just with their only research, one research, 3 million jobs and the biggest constituencies of U.S. middle class. Going back to Italy and this book, most of the book is about most of this chapter is about education and training human capital, because as said, the question here is not whether, I don't think the question here is whether technology will jeopardize job. The only question is how can we be better prepared to basically provide a base to first our youth, and second to people who are now in employment, so they don't find themselves trapped. And I don't think we are doing a good job. You can see the numbers in this book, but just to start, it's already a fact that STEM jobs are very important in this digitalized, if I may, society. In Italy, in 2015, 39% of our graduates graduated in humanities. And and when you go to all the figures, like Italy ranks last third in a statistic of the European Commission that basically ranks all countries in Europe according to their digital ability. And we are last third, and one of the things where we are the weakest is really human capital. And when I say human capital, I mean education, I mean number of ICT specialists in the country, I mean even our ability to solve complex problems with computers, math, basic use of technology, number of people who have ever used a computer. And if we look more at our statistics, even school, right? I mean, we are the worst in the OECD in terms of age. Our teacher body, 62% of our professors are above 52. And across all the dimensions, even the tax cuts, the cuts that we got since 2008. So it's very interesting because people really complained about the so-called buona scuola, but in reality, if you see the figures from 2008 to 2013, school cuts, school expenditure went down 13%. But then, with the buona scuola, the government injected 3 billion euros a year in hiring and paying salaries to new professors. And so the gap, just if you take the average from 2008 to 2016, it went, you got a sudden increase. And so that cut, the average cut is only 6%. What is a bit scary to me is we are not. There's been some. First of all, I think during the electoral campaign there was almost no voice regarding school and education, and even the good things that we've done in the last few years risk to be scrapped. Now, when we talk about school, we are talking about not providing any training to professors who are graduating from university and just drop them immediately into the job, as if this job, and it's such an important job, like taking care of our children, like training our children, did not require any training. And we are scraping things like, paying a merit bonus, even calling professors. So a problem that we have here in Italy is that, we have many professors in subject fields where there is no demand, and it's very hard to find certain professors in certain subjects. So with the new proposal of the government to scrap this direct call, you may actually, this problem can actually never find a solution. Yesterday night we had sorry, just to cut a long story short, my proposal will be really to revise the curriculum and to provide more training to professors, and most of all to provide orientation to kids who are in school and who are in university, and even provide better training to people who are even in work. If you are in the U.S., I spend my life between here and the U.S. In the U.S., training is tax deductible. Costs that are assumed to look for a job are cost deductible, and you can even carry forward your loss for when you will have an income. And I think these things are very, very important. Then quickly, last night we were having dinner with Florian, and we're discussing what are the key infrastructure. This is a point that he picked today, talking about investments in intangibles. I think, again, education is the number one intangible a country should focus on. And second is really broadband or any infrastructure that is actually providing more offer of digital products, because when you have offer, then soon you get the demand, and so people get acquainted. They're naturally inserted and emerged into a world that is actually the world of the future. And last, I like to pick a couple of points that Max made. One that I found very interesting is that he said that in the German debate or global debate, there is a question on whether taxing work rather than capital, right? And this for me is very interesting. It's something I thought about, this big conflict of dichotomy between work and capital when I was writing this chapter. And I don't know if, it's because I have, one, I think I spend a lot of time in the US. And second, in my think tank, there are a lot of venture capitalists. So I think I tend to see the world through their eyes. It's given that work cannot produce the same return of capital. This is already proven, right? And so I wonder why we cannot all work together or accept to overcome this big dichotomy, mostly to provide workers with capital rights. And I'm not talking about, you can have unions or workers sitting on boards. I'm really talking about the financial effects. Because in a world where people have shorter work spans or have intermittent or non-continuous, jobs, they really need to save more and they need to have more upside. Here, there was actually a very interesting study made by France Digital in France, where they measure the income gap or the salary gap in companies that where venture capital invested. So venture capital is really distributes stock option and stocks within the organization. And thanks to the fact that employees were rewarded with stocks, the salary gap within the company was lower. So I really believe that we should. It's also more expensive for a company to not just to pay people by the hour or a fixed salary and give them, stock reward. But this is also a way to let employees participate in the upside. Is a big way to allow really people can potentially become rich with one work if that works. If it doesn't work, if the company really doesn't perform, you may not become rich, but you still have the ability to be wealthier than just with your regular salary. And another 2 points I like to make, it was very interesting when you talked about industrial policy. It's particularly interesting to make this point in Italy, where I think it's a concept, an alien concept, actually. But and it was very interesting that you made the point of to have this industrial policy mission-oriented, of U.S. and China really tackling it, of Germany thinking it in a way, France maybe making it a bit different and maybe better. In my opinion, this is a place, in my opinion, this is something where we really need to think about this as a Europeans. I think it's really a shame that we continue thinking about industrial policy and even anything as a single country, because as a single country, we don't have the critical mass to really compete internationally, to foster the next international champions. Single markets are not big enough. And generally speaking, in any big international context, as a single country, we really are too small and count pretty much nothing. I'm a big believer in the European Union, but I take the opportunity, as I have two Germans at the table from Progressive Centrum. I think Germany is very smart. I think, generally speaking, has been very smart in thinking throughout industrial policy. It's been a country that could, within 10 years, connect Eastern Germany and make it, and being really an engine for growth in Europe. I think you guys, with all due respect, should be a little smarter when you sit in Europe, because frankly, I saw the way the Greek situation was handled, and definitely at that European Union level at that time, there was clearly a German, whispering, and I think it was handled very poorly. And the way, the situation was handled, I think, in 2011, in the middle of the sovereign crisis, in Italy, and later with banks, I think we see the results now. This, terrible anti-Europeism that we are living, it was also part of choices that were made back then. And I'm saying this just because I think the only way for us to not to be trapped in this wave of the fourth industrial revolution is to receive it as Europeans, and receiving with a diverse Europe, where we all try to make a compromise, but it cannot be a unilateral set of structure. And finally, I'd like to pick your point on the gig economy. It was very interesting. There was an article on the Financial Times last week. Once a year, the Financial Times makes the ranking of the best, British or European companies, tech companies, and they decided to leave out Deliveroo. Not much because it fitted all the criteria, growth and employment and everything. Just there was this big question mark on what is sharing with society. And I frankly was caught by the article, and I thought about it, and I was discussing this with my friend who's a venture capitalist. And he said, you know what, if Deliveroo had to hire these people or reserve the social rights, the margin that it makes are so small that it could not survive. So some of these companies actually have a model that is incompatible, and probably we should not even think about them as jobs. So probably people who are working for Deliveroo should definitely not be considered employed, because in my opinion are just taking advantage of something that is completely not there. It's a bit like a school professor that is giving tuition. You don't think that the school professor giving tuition is a full-time employee, cannot rely on something that is here and there, right? And I think it's better to have a gig company not to have it. So we should keep that in mind. And last but not least, I like to crack a joke or report you a gossip. My same friend who I discussed this with, the venture capitalist, he's Italian, he's born here, he left to go to the US when he was 15. And our general consul general in New York, he's very smart. Every time a senior figure of our government visits New York, he calls the Italian intelligentsia and allows the government figure to interact with them. And he wrote me a text message. He was appalled, and he said, guys, I just want you to let you know that we want to back off from recent labor reforms, and our plan is to basically force startups to hire full-time people full-time. And my friend, who's a venture capitalist, he has all these guys working for startups for free before even they can take off, before they can raise funding. He was so shocked that he wrote me a text message. And I'm saying this because I think we need, when we design policies, we need reality checks. And I think we should really think the best for our workers by making sure that there are jobs out there. Because if I am a venture capitalist and a senior figure of the government says that he's going to force startups to hire people full-time just to create jobs, I think I'm going to stop investments in Italy. And another thing I would encourage my country to do, I think we've always been very much focused across sectors to create jobs more than to create skill sets or skills or know-how or competencies. And in this society, this is not going to work. And so going back to the chapter and concluding my comment here is really, please, let's focus on education and training, and obviously orientation as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Carlotta. I think we achieved the first objective, which was to present the book and the work of the book to kind of audience, the Italian audience, and I think now we have the second objective of this presentation, just to have questions, comments, suggestions, critics, etc. Then I would like to open the floor to everybody. Want to make questions, want to make comments, want to make suggestions to what has been raised, or questions about subjects which are not raised during the presentation, but should, according to you, be in such kind of thinking regarding one of the main problem of our next generation probably of industrial relation and employment relation. Then I open the floor and I hope you have many questions, many suggestions, few critics. Please. Who would like to start? Dario?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you again, and thanks for all your contributions that are extremely worth, and I mean, open up for many questions, but I will restrict myself to just some points. Well, first of all, and I think this is something that we will go through even in the next sessions, coming to some of the things that both Florian and Max have raised. I'd like to have your opinion on how much of the forecasts that we can make about how many jobs will be destroyed, if some jobs will be destroyed, how they will be reshaped, where, in which firms, in which regions, and so on and so forth, and how much these forecasts are affected by the theoretical or conceptual standpoint that we adopt, and even if you want the implicit empirical approach, even just thinking at it, that we adopt. Because my feeling, and this is partly a critique that has been raised even with respect to the Freied-Osborne work, is that thinking at things like all things being equal as an approach, or having an equilibrium model in our mind, when we do know that technological change is by definition an out of equilibrium process, because it's something that disrupts, that changes structurally the equilibria that we are looking at today. So my fear as a researcher that aims also to provide suggestions to policymakers is trying to stay far, at least as much as possible, from an idea that says, okay, given that the structure of the economy, of the employment structure, of the characteristics of occupation remains as such, or with some variations, but on the structure that we are observing today, how can we steer the system towards, a path that is with a little much more of this and little less of that? So my point here is that aren't we facing the necessity of adopting a theoretical and conceptual approach that is, in a way, what Max evoked, I mean, driving the change, since this is a change that is not neutral, that is human-made, that after all, even if we sometimes conceptualize technology as something falling from the sky and we cannot do anything apart from accept it, and if this is not the case, my question, if you want, or provocation is, don't we need to have a theoretical and empirical approach that is really far away from the standards that we use to, evaluate a policy that is an incentive and see how much it has been effective in spurring this or that economic variables? And beside this, if we don't need to realize that if this is a systemic change, we need to be, let's say, drivers of this change. And so, thinking, as Mariana Mazzucato has said repeatedly, having a kind of protagonism of all relevant social actors, starting with states and governments, in driving and designing which kind of innovation we would like to have. Because it's not said that we need to accept all kind of innovations if the social outcome is not acceptable at the end.
On the back.
Good morning. Yes, a question for Carlotta Di Franceschi. I really appreciate your provocation about gig jobs, saying that they are not really jobs. Maybe I didn't understand well. So my question is, what are for you these kind of jobs? Because actually we know that these jobs are characterized by a very high intensification of work and a very high level of exploitation. For instance, delivery riders have to take an order in 30 seconds without knowing where they have to go. Or we know also that there is a debate on this nature of jobs. We know that in Britain there was a discussion that ended up with a recognition of drivers of Uber as an employee. And we also know that, for instance, algorithms, as was saying before one of the speakers, are designed in a way to reach some goals. And for instance, we know that in Uber, algorithms usually are used also to extract information from the workers without the workers knowing this. How it happens? Because sometimes drivers are forced to take direction that are not the main streets because the algorithm need to get the information on the streets, on the traffic, etc. So for me, these kind of jobs are actually an example, a symbolic example of how the future of work can be, given the social and political condition that, for instance, the Irish speaker was underlining. So summing up, I would like you to motivate better this statement that for me it's very strong. Thank you.
Excuse me, maybe there is a problem with loss in translation. So the word job for me, I think Max will explain it better. He said independent versus dependent versus third thing. In my opinion, it's a third thing. Job is anything. You can do a job pro bono. You can do a job once. You can do a job that is full of content or not full of content. Obviously, these people, work. So I'm not saying that it's not a job per se. What I'm saying, it cannot be treated as a dependent work. In my opinion, it cannot be treated even as an independent work, because independent work for me is somebody who is self-employed, who is, is providing kind of a service, right? For me, these are jobs that are almost intermitted, right? So I give you an example. There is a company called GLG that pays experts, right? Pays experts to provide, to make people like me or, senior experts who just, provide they're like a platform that intermediates our knowledge with the ones of whoever signs up for this service. This is not a job that is heavy. It's a job, maybe we make 6 or 10 calls a year, right? These 6, 10 calls a year, for me, I'm not an employee of this platform, nor I feel that I am an independent worker serving this platform, right? And I made the example because you're picking up on jobs that are very heavy from a physical point of view, but you could take jobs that are not very heavy from a physical point of view. What I think is you cannot, in the framework, number one should be the companies can survive. Because if you design because now you're smiling, but it's true. Because if tomorrow I force Deliveroo to hire all these people, with the margins they have, there is no more Deliveroo. I understand what you're making, but if I have, it's very practical. This is very practical. If I have, let's say, €1 million and the cost of labor costs €2 million, then there is no company. So it's not that you can. I don't understand why you're making this face. It's a matter of fact, right? It's a matter of fact. Cost of work must be cheaper than the overall cost, because if it is higher than my margin, then there is no company. So I really don't get what you're saying. I don't think people should look at the job at Deliveroo even as an employee, as a job that is sitting there, right? It's not. In my opinion, this is a job that you take when you are in transition, when you're making up money, not a job as a regular job. So probably what you could say is that no Deliveroo biker can make more than a certain hours. So you kind of make sure that people don't, or for a longer, continuously. So if people cannot work at Deliveroo for more than, 1 year, or cannot work for more than a certain number of hours per year, otherwise you're forced to hire the person, right? You should not think that a company that has such a tiny margin base the model on the fact that is not hiring people, right? And I don't even think that these people should be considered independent, because in my mind, you cannot think of these jobs as something that you do continuously. Because if Deliveroo is your option, you probably better stay home and take unemployment income, right? Because this cannot be a job, a full-time job, or a form of continuous employment. Cannot be, because it's not in their model. But if you're telling me that if I'm an entrepreneur, right? And if you're telling me, if the choice here is having a company and provide some jobs that are jobs, yes, but cannot be continuous jobs. If the option is not to have a company at all, then you can opt for it. Because Fedora has already left. Sorry.
Yeah, just like very briefly to this issue you've just been addressing. I mean, because you talked so much about venture capital, right? I mean, what you also have to see, and there's a really great chapter in the book by John Zeisman and Martin Kenny about how venture capital basically funds companies for a couple of years, although they don't have a margin at all, right? So Uber is not making any profits, but still they exist for 5-6 years and then they are growing. So this kind of model of pushing towards becoming a monopole structure funded by venture capital, that's quite a thing in the digital sphere. That's just what I'm saying. To Dario's point about what's the model? What are the premises, the assumptions of the model? I think the biggest risk we face as a society is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because people really like to live in exceptional times. So we are so much focused on this idea of if you assume this and that and this kind of model and then happening, then you come up at an end point where everyone is becoming unemployed, right? So you kind of fetishize a scenario where we are all doomed, and we talk 90% of the time about this scenario. I'm not saying that general artificial intelligence will never be developed and therefore we shouldn't think about it. I'm just saying that is very, very, very unlikely. So let's think about this kind of scenario 5% of the time, and 95% of the time let's think about robust strategies that make sense no matter what the future will bring. And I mean, the issue of skills development, for example, I mean, that makes sense no matter what the future will bring. To me, it's kind of comparable to climate change, right? I mean, we can discuss what will the level of tide rise, you know, and how much will the temperature rise, all these kind of issues, but still fighting climate change and, you know, doing the right thing to tackle climate change makes sense no matter what your model is, you know? So I think like a self-fulfilling prophecy is one of the biggest dangers. To a couple of points Carlotta has been making. I mean, yeah, skills and STEM and all these kind of things, that is important, but also we shouldn't underestimate the value and the asset we have in Europe with the rich tradition of humanities. And when you look at the MIT, for example, the new college they have just been building for $500 million, which is trying to combine, you know, data science with the humanities, right? To trying to combine the value the both strands of science, so to say, bring. And I think, I mean, this approach of brute force AI and AI skill development, I mean, this is what the Chinese are doing at the moment, right? Let's produce as many PhDs in machine learning as possible, and then quantity in the end will lead to quality. Yes, that is an approach, but I would always kind of tackle this singularity debate we have, right? Where you're like, general artificial intelligence is merging with the human being, blah, 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 all these kind of issue with the concept of multiplicity, where you combine a plurality of human beings and a plurality of smart machines. And I think for the majority of tasks our society will face in the future, the best, so to say, actor to tackle this task is multiplicity, which means a plurality of human actors and a plurality of machine actors. And we in Europe have a very, very rich tradition. I mean, when you look at the AI science community, I mean, machine learning is one thing, but there are so many interesting things happening beyond machine learning in Italy, for example, in Germany, for example. And we shouldn't focus too much on kind of keeping up with the Americans, with the Chinese, but we should also focus on the rich asset, also research-wise, intellectually, intelligentsia-wise, we have in Europe. And then the issue of people saving more for the future. You made this point, right? I mean, what the big problem we face at the moment is you have this big companies, the superstar firms, which come into a certain sector, into a market, and this means that their profits are going up. The pay is kind of okay within these companies, right? But because these companies drive out competitors out of the market, other competitors, other companies who have more employees are basically being driven out of the market. So that in the end, in a certain sector, in a certain market, you have a falling labor share, which is a problem, right? So you have like profits going up for one company, but the labor share in total in this sector is going down. That's what we observed in the US in the past 20 years, and what we increasingly observe in Germany and in Europe, I assume, as well, which is a problem. And then your point about European digital industrial policy, I mean, yes, that's totally right. I mean, when you think about like data-driven business models, you need a market of 500 million people or so it makes sense to think that in a European way. But then again, I think we have to balance. We have to we have to analyze the trade-off between, on the one hand, this kind of superstar firm dynamic I just described, and kind of delivering on creating European digital champions. So yes, we want European digital champions, but we shouldn't run into the risk of this kind of superstar dynamics I just described. That would be like the European approach to me.
Okay, I would like all to provide some comments on what you said, but also to go to your question, Dario. How much of the forecasts are affected by the theoretical framework? My response is it depends. It depends if you are looking on data that has been accumulated in the past, and then we can clearly see the trends in the data. However, even in this case, we see different studies concluding in different points. Let me give you an example. In a study that we ran at Bruegel for covering 6 European countries, we concluded that one additional robot replaces 3.4 workers on average. And these 6 countries is Germany, France, Sweden, Finland, Italy, and I'm forgetting one. But that is a much smaller effect than the American estimate. However, there are other studies that they have pointed to the directions that the automation of the past 2 decades has led to 9.6 million more jobs. So I think it depends on the framework you take into account. We need a more unified framework. That is true. And that is a point that it is fair. So we have the studies that show a negative effect so far, and studies that they show a positive effect. Now, the question is, what is the difference? And I think the difference is not so much on the model, but it is on some particular assumptions you take into the model. And that is something that needs to be more discussed and debated. Now, if you look in the future, it's very difficult to run an empirical exercise or run a theoretical model without having the characteristics, the specifics. So the Frey and Osborne analysis you referred to was a prediction of what will be feasible in the future. So, but apart from that, we need an equilibrium analysis to see what will be the investment patterns, how firms will react, what will be the labor demand fluctuations in the future. And we don't have this information right now. Now, for me, the main criticism on Frey and Osborne that show the 47% jobs at risk in the US, and by the way, if we run the same exercise in Europe, the percentage is even higher, 54% of jobs at risk in Europe, is that they focus on jobs and not job tasks, on whole occupations. And when I derive a prediction on whole occupations, I risk not to take into account the fact that technology may not be able to automate, to replace labor in a wide variety of tasks within this occupation. And this is the reason that we have the OECD study that shows a much lower degree. So again, we see that in this future era, we don't have models, and we need to build, and we don't have data. Now, there were other 2 points that I wanted to make. The one is on the question of back there on the gig economy, and I think, and the other is on Carlotta's point on education. First of all, I fully agree with Carlotta that we need a new approach and a new vision on education. And since we have free mobility, since we have some level of integration across the unity, I believe that it will be helpful, this educational vision, to come in a European level and through discussions between member states. Let me give you an example. As we said that technology will create some jobs. How can we ensure that we will take the advantage of these opportunities? We need a solid education system, that it is transformed so that direct young generation into the direction of where the labor demand will be in the future, on the jobs will be created by technology, but also we need to have in place lifelong training systems and incentivize people to do that, because it is not only the young that should be benefited about that, but it's also people that they are already in the labor market, so that to have the opportunity to readjust, to reestablish themselves through these systems. And for this reason, and actually big companies, they have already have in place internal educational training systems for their employees. The problem is, what about the other companies, what they will do? And there we need the state intervention, we need coordination, and we need contracts between employer and employees in which also take into account this necessity of retraining on these new technologies and how they can implement it in the job task they operate. On the gig economy question, and this is my final point, we should take into account the specificities of each case. And the specificities in this case is the business model. For example, the European Court of Justice have concluded that Uber exerts an increased control to its drivers. Does this imply something for the employment relationship between Uber and its drivers? This is an open question. But the right of control of the company to the people that provide service is a crucial element in the definition of employment, not the only one, because in collaborative economy you have also flexibility, which is something very nice. I can work whenever I want, for as long as I want, and this is something we should keep, because this is the real benefit these models bring. But in some particular business models that we have an increased right of control of the provision of the service, and this can be just by case analysis, by looking in the specificity of the business model, then there probably should be also room for some protection. And we should not forget, when you are talking about savings, that we are human beings, and by definition, we are very myopic when we make investment decisions. Thank you.
So my question
from the back.
My question builds on several of the recent comments about policy here and follows up on Dario's comments earlier. And I think one of the issues, especially as we talk about training programs and the skills programs, is there's substantial uncertainty that still characterizes, like you mentioned, Georgios, the forecasts of what technology will do next and what it will change. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, it was precisely actually the skilled workers who are harmed by technological innovation, something Daron Acemoglu has often pushed strongly. And so when we talk about skills and retraining for the new age, I'm just curious to hear kind of practical perspectives on how we make sure that those are sufficiently flexible systems to adjust when technology naturally responds to in different ways. Oftentimes innovation is directed towards often workers who are very expensive and would love to be able to automate. So curious to hear your thoughts on policy that can remain flexible in this substantially uncertain technology environment.
Thank you. Any other question? Please.
Yes, I would like to make a point about one of the specificities and of the most important things of your book, which is about the case study approach. And I think it's something interesting also related to what Max was talking about the partnership thing and the sort of European model, which is actually something different compared to the Silicon Valley and the Shenzhen one. And this is also about the directionality and the demography of one industry, of one economy, of one socio-economic model. I think that we really cannot take into account all the development of the future work in a sort of a neutral way, abstract way, just like if there was a kind of education model which is sort of good for every single case, every single country, without taking stock also of the institutional inertia of these models, and also about the different traditions that can lead to different outcomes and different sort of weaknesses and strengths to develop and to sort of further foster in order to get all the best without dealing also with the consequences of the future of work.
Thank you. At the back here after. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, Luca Marcolin from the OECD, Science, Technology and Innovation. Thank you all for the contributions. It was an interesting morning. I want to pick up the questions about policy and skills, policies for skills. Now, a slight background, we have a forthcoming paper that looks at interoccupational mobility. So we are trying to see, well, we measure the distance across occupations in terms of worker skills, and we sort of try to create neighborhoods of occupations and see which occupations of destinations can be reached through a moderate amount of retraining of workers. Now, one thing that I cannot endorse enough the idea that skills in the workforce are lacking to a certain or large extent. Though another aspect of the discussion is simply that the human capital endowment is already there, but it's been misused, and it's something that I haven't perceived enough in the discussion nowadays. So now perhaps the more precise question is, how do you activate the skills that are already present? How do you put them to good use? I think this is part of the policy discourse that perhaps we shouldn't forget.
Thank you. Here in the first row.
Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for the interesting issues that have been raised, which deserve deep investigation. I think there is one question that should be taken into account, and I wonder if you have considered this question in your research. And this is the necessity, in my opinion, that the balance between job destruction and job creation of technical change should be treated only taking account of the structural change that technical innovations produce. And this structural change can be seen in two ways, looking at the changes in the coefficient of production of the matrix of the coefficient production of the whole systems, and the change in the final demand. These are the two drivers of the shifts in labor and capital among sectors, and in the quantitative increase of production and employment. And in order to do this, we need to have a clear vision of what the price and income elasticity of demand is, because the crucial point is the amount of demand and the change in the structure of demand. So we need to have a look at income and at price elasticity, because technical change also generates change in relative prices, of course. And it seems to me rather lacking this approach, but without taking account of these forces, we miss the point. Either we consider a single case, or we go back to the past and see what's happening in the past, which is not worth. This is the. So I wonder if you consider this aspect in a kind of model capable of at least spotting the variables which are determinant for the net final result. Second thing is about welfare. Do you really think that the financing of the welfare system can be still based on the contribution of the workers? I think that the new welfare system has to raise the funding from capital. I mean, the idea, the funny idea of the proposal of Bill Gates of taxing the robots, well, it's just seems silly at first view, but in reality, the point is how can you finance in a way in which there is a plurality of works and long periods of transitions between one job and another, in which there is a great uneven distribution of the income. And this is another issue which should be taken account to see if it really depends on technological polarization or on other things like imperfections in the market, oligopoly and monopoly and so on. This is another issue. But really, in a changing, in a very flexible world of jobs and transition from one job to another, really the welfare system must be financed by a general taxation, I think. Otherwise, we penalize the firms which adopt more intensive, labor-intensive process, and firms which are less labor-intensive process would contribute in a very insignificant way to the financing of the welfare system. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, please? Here.
Yes, I would like to know whether you mentioned some data, some empirical researches about the effects of technological innovation. And you found contrasting results according to the period, perhaps if I understood, according to the country taken into consideration. I would like to know if in these researches can be taken into account whether there have been in the different countries and different periods policies that can have that aimed to compensate, for instance, the negative effects on employment, so to increase aggregate demand or increase demand in some specific sectors, because this, of course, would make a difference in the results you found.
Thank you.
Good morning. Just to point a secondary question to the last one about welfare, no? I was so interested and curious about your focal point in your presentation about to tackling income and wealth inequality via regulation, no? Regulation in the sense of our Italian debate in which the state intervened about some relevant question about the inequality with some regulation opportunities, no, to represent the idea of the income distributing the different category of citizens and workers. Something more about this, because I know that it's a very, very crucial point in our future in which automatically government and states can represent the interest of all people and selecting some regulation opportunities very different from others in our recent past. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question from the floor? Okay. I would just add a point on the welfare state and then give the floor to the round table. I mean, you mentioned the golden word of the 90 in the last 20 years, which was flex security. I mean, as a golden rule and golden word. I don't want to go in the discussion, but it's quite clear, perhaps then the flex security didn't work very well in the transition period. Do you see any other golden word for the next digital age, or flex security still available? Who starts?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I think basically all the golden words are already around. It's more about kind of reinventing them. So, I mean, obviously it is about solidarity, cooperation, all these kind of issues, right? I mean, and we shouldn't forget, I mean, when we depict kind of the Uber worker or the Deliveroo rider as someone, you know, who has like very harsh working conditions, I mean, yes, that was true 150 years ago or like 80 years ago for certain sectors as well, right? And then we came up with certain, you know, social innovations, so to say, that were fought for by certain people who organized themselves within society, and then we came up with mechanisms that you could call regulation to have better working conditions for these kind of people. And I think we are still in a very premature early phase in coming up with these social innovations. I mean, Florian talked a little bit about what the Swedes are discussing with regard to, you know, collective agreements or organizing, labor organizing on platform companies. And I think that's a very premature field, but we're going to see, or we have to see much more innovation on how to cooperate, how to actually deliver on goals of solidarity in these kind of companies. And that also leads me to the question of welfare, because what I see is the income distribution is skewed, and it's likely to become more skewed because of digitalization. So you have to work on the income distribution before taxes, that is about skills, human capital, all this kind of stuff, but you also have to think about what shall we actually tax, because in my opinion, the demands towards the welfare state will be higher and not lower in the future. We really need this welfare state for a transition phase that will not be 5 years, but rather 20 years, and it ain't going to be a walk in the park, you know, and we need these kind of funds. And the question is, where do they come from? And I think like people on different positions on the political spectrum have different kind of opinions where to take this kind of money from. But I mean, quite honestly, quite frankly, in European societies, we don't have a lack of wealth in our society. So the money is there. You just have to bring it to the right place. And I mean, depends on where you stand politically, what kind of instruments you then choose in the end, I would say. And just like a very brief demand on lifelong learning, also what Giorgio said, because, you know, ask politicians, ask parties who ran a campaign on lifelong learning how they performed in the elections. Quite badly, right? So the idea of lifelong learning, that is something people long for, people want lifelong learning, that's just not true. And why is that? Because like in the 50s or 60s, lifelong learning meant you used to work, you know, on the fabrication line, you know, in a car manufacturer, and then you did lifelong learning, you did like reskilling, retraining, you became someone with a higher salary, you bought a bigger house, 2 cars, 3 times a year, you went on vacation. What does it mean nowadays? When we talk to people about lifelong learning, what we basically mean is either you engage in lifelong learning all your life long, or you will basically fall out of the labor market and out of the middle class. So that's not a very attractive narrative, right? So I rather ask myself from a political perspective, how do we actually depict lifelong learning as something that is increasing sovereignty about one's life for people and not something you have to engage in because otherwise you will just be basically expelled out of the system? To polarize a bit at the end.
So, yeah, many interesting comments. I just one brief comment on skills, and then I just want to say something about the US and European models. Skills are definitely important, but I think in many ways we put too much emphasis on skills and not enough on work organization. So, you know, skills are fine and necessary, but in a sense they're a necessary but not sufficient condition. So what happens to your skilled worker when they arrive in a workplace at 25, and what will happen to them in the average mid-sized firm in Naples versus the average mid-sized firm in Baden-Württemberg. You know, at what stage will they be able to use those skills into what purpose, etc. So I think that's, you know, the two are interdependent. I mean, just going back to the very first question there about the structures, I mean, in a sense, this efficiency-productivity trade-off is, in a sense, what comes out of the basic model. But then how that gets worked, how that gets resolved and developed and invested in and so on will look very different in different countries. So just to take an example, like a core of the Nordic model has always been to take away the low productivity jobs, to see those employers go out of business, basically. So you up the, you know, you set a floor to wages, and in a sense, the Rehn-Meidner model in Sweden is very explicit about it. It says, if, you know, the local shop goes out of business, so what? You know, now it doesn't just say so what, it also says we have 6 other things to do. We have a welfare state and investment and retraining and so on. But they do say we don't want the local shop with bad jobs. Now they have local shops with bad jobs, but not as many. So that is a very different view than Uber, because to me, Uber isn't creating a bad labor market in the US. Uber exists because there is a bad labor market in the US. Uber exists because people have terrible, terrible conditions. So there's nowhere else to go. So, I mean, it's extremely convenient. I go to the US a lot, and it's very convenient, and it has an effect in the labor market. But the key thing is, you know, the bottom of the labor market in the US is incredibly vulnerable. I mean, existentially different from the situation in Denmark, for example, you know. So I think that there does, I think just very briefly, the US and European models, like the US model is an interesting one because it has this huge dynamism in the lead sectors, but it doesn't really generalize to the economy as a whole. So it's not just about inequality, it's also about the generalizing of living standards and the degree of participation and so on. So even things like venture capital is incredibly dynamic, but part of the reason why venture capital is so important is because the basic banking sector doesn't do its job in terms of providing working capital to firms. So in that sense, you know, Wells Fargo is really bad at doing stuff that you would expect Wells Fargo to do for medium-sized businesses. So therefore, venture capital becomes better. Now, I'm overstating it a bit, but that's the basic logic. So I just think, you know, so if, you know, if I was a policymaker for the US, I would say there's a reconnection there in the very boring stuff behind, you know, trying to just get your ordinary regional banks to do stuff that will help to get, you know, firms from here to here and so on. And there is an interesting role of the state in the US and so on that Fred Block has talked about, and Mariano Mazzucato and so on. And then just the last comment, which is around Europe. So I think the European model is at a very difficult place because actually when you look at work organization, Europe is more polarized than we realize, I think. Because if you look at, so if you imagine dropping 10 billion of investment in artificial intelligence into Italy versus into Germany in the next year, what would happen to it? So what kind of firms, what's the work organization? And when you look at modes of work organization, you know, Sweden is dominated by learning and lean. You know, those are like, you know, the whole work organization is set up to accommodate, you know, to promote worker learning and decision making. And Italy, France, you know, countries that are pretty strong economically are still very weak on those fronts. So probably what will happen is a lot of automation of more tailored systems. So you may just not get the, you know, so actually the European model is a bit more, it's actually flipped inside out. It should be growing in the middle, driven by demand, and on the periphery, driven by, you know, hardy, low-cost, dynamic exporters. But actually the model is, you know, restrict fiscal measures in the middle and act like we're all small-scale exporters, which in a sense undermines the capacity of, it's just a big collective action problem, but that's not how an economy of 500 million people, etc., should see itself. But that's a bigger issue.
Thank you, Georgios.
You want to go first? Yeah. Just a quick point, and also bearing kind of like the lunch break in mind. I don't want to steal too much of your time, obviously, from your lunch break. But on the comment on kind of like the relationship between automation policies and kind of like, you know, what kind of like skills programs are needed. I think it's probably worth mentioning that most of the research that we see on the automation of jobs, you know, kind of like focuses on the kind of like, you know, macro picture. Where we look at, you know, economies, and we look at the, you know, potential effects of, you know, robots or automation and so on the labor market. I mean, it's definitely worth kind of like, you know, mentioning and also pursuing kind of like some research which really looks like, you know, what's happening at the business level and also at the local economy, because this is really where people will feel the impact and kind of like where labor markets are changing. And rather than trying to kind of like predict what's going to happen in the future, because we're extremely bad at that generally. And if you have a look at the kind of like, you know, economic discipline and, you know, political science and so on, it's extremely difficult to do that. It might be worth kind of like looking, you know, at some of the data that's already available and trying to get an understanding of, you know, what's already happening in the labor market. And I think there's some interesting think tank work actually in the UK, which looks at, you know, the skills mismatch of kind of like local labor markets. So trying to meet, you know, demand and supply on the kind of like local level. And here some researchers have been using data of FE levels, so that's people who come out of vocational training mainly, and they've matched that the kind of like qualifications and skills they acquire through you know, vocational training, and they've matched that with local job adverts. So doing this and matching this, they get a relatively good idea of, you know, whether there is a skills mismatch in a certain areas and what are the actual kind of like qualifications and skills required to make that happening. And I think here it's also, I mean, from a policy, you know, point of view and what kind of policies can you design, it might also be worth remembering, you know, that we already have institutions in place that facilitate, you know, the exchange between business, public service and workers. And we see that in some chapters also in the book, in the Scandinavian model, and it might be worth investing more in deepening kind of like social partnerships. And I mean, it's really easy usually to say that on a panel, but it's actually kind of like, you know, hard work in kind of like, you know, regions and in local economies. And not so much focusing maybe on the symbolic politics of, you know, trying to address, you know, the changes that technology will bring about. And for instance, I mean, the individual workers or individual activity account has become quite a popular thing. France is trialing it. Germany is looking at doing it. So accounts where workers can build up a capital stock, a sum of money, or, you know, that they can use for retraining and reskilling. But it might be worth, as I said, to look more into kind of like the, you know, how can we foster the dialogue between businesses, the public sector, and kind of like workers' representatives on a local level to meet the demands and challenges of, you know, the technological revolution that is about. But with data, and here I'm totally with Georgios, we need more information on that. And I think here, you know, this might also be the role of, you know, think tanks and institutions like INAPP, who should kind of like facilitate and kind of like also push kind of like the public sector to think about that and to provide researchers with the data that's actually needed to understand the changes that we're currently going through. And I think there's not being enough done because, I mean, as we all know as researchers, there are very few countries that actually provide this kind of like detailed granular data on labor markets, you know, that we can actually work with and, you know, where we can actually see and understand the changes.
Thank you, Florian. Very quickly, because we need to have a lunch break. So on the questions about the modeling and the additional factors like the income elasticity of demand and policies. Let me clarify that the most of the models that come out on this and provide some interesting insights, they have as an year 2018. So it's quite a new branch of research that goes into this dimension, studying in a general equilibrium framework these different dimensions. And there we see that the income elasticity of demand is taken into account, but there is no any evidence on what are the different forces, but there is only a provision of a net effect. So we need more research in order to underline what is the impact through the income elasticity of demand, how the behavior of income elasticity of demand over the years changed the impact of automation, and we don't have answers to that. So that is a point that should be further investigated. And the same applies also if we go to study particular policies. In Europe, there are data sets. We are currently working with these data sets but, at Bruegel, but we haven't so far reached a level to describe how policies affect the impact of automation on employment. And for sure, this is a key question to ask if you want to design the policy initiatives in the future. Two last remarks. On Florian's point about we should rather not predict what will happen in the future because we do that really bad. I understand your concerns, but sometimes such efforts motivate debate, motivate discussion, and we can only benefit from that. Frey and Osborne paper was published, the working paper in 2013. There were so many discussions after that, and the evolution was to see, look, there are some approach, the approach of Frey and Osborne may not be the appropriate one to follow this debate. So even I understand completely your point, but try to look at the future can always motivate insightful discussion. Last point to Max, thanks for this question. I would see that as a failure of politicians to provide the correct perception of what lifelong learning means. And definitely I don't mean that it should be perceived of something that we do outside the job market, but it is something we do while we are in the job market preparing for the future. And probably just throwing an idea, going to practical recommendations that some people there ask is, what about in employment contract we have a specific time of training period each year in order to be able to get to know better the new technologies in our field. Thank you.
I just would like to pick up on Max's point. I think he's on welfare. Not much adding anything on what he said. Just that I think, in Italy so far, our system I think is surviving just because we have a big, almost family capitalism in the sense that families are somehow bridging the gap where welfare is not arriving. I think we have, a huge problem now. If you look at the statistics, people at, risk of poverty, 65% of people who are at risk of poverty are kind of not ending up in poverty just because there is one retired person in the family. So we pass from an income, wage income to pension income. And I think our system is so much in stress that even if we look at healthcare, because they are the two big pillars, our total expenditure in Italy is under 40 billion, and 40 billion are out of pocket, which is completely uncommon in any developed market. The reason why I'm saying this is because I think we really need to kind of have, I think, a holistic view to reform our system. And I guess now, there is a budget law, but in general, I heard talks in the press of our government willing to reform it. And I think it would be better to look at, I think we should really look at the future and even the best, the best practices around the world, because I really think we are far, any government, even the one prior to this, really far from finding a solution. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Dario, if you want to make some final comments from INAPP point of view, since have you been? Yeah, come here.
No, since we are quite late. Yeah. No, since we are quite late, thank you. First of all, thank you all again for this amazing contribution that you gave. Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. Just to say that we're supposed to be here at 2 sharp, or 5:10 past 2, but then sharp. Also because President Sacchi will give his introductory address at the beginning of the afternoon's session. So thank you and have a good lunch.
Thank you. Thank you very much.